Hey guys, and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your kind of blast from the past 1970s documentary there, and that you learned a lot about some kind of wild interspecific interactions between plants and their pollinators. Um, Now, I would like to finish up our first lesson on interspecific interactions. Um, in the last video, I showed you kind of 6 different strategies for species interacting with each other in terms of whether one or both species benefit, hurt, or don't affect each other at all. Okay, yes, you just watched lots of ways in which two species can benefit from one another, or one species, the plant, can benefit from the insect, but the insect certainly is not benefiting at all. Okay, so I want to go through a few more examples here. Mutualism. Again, the video talked a lot about pollination. I'd like to talk a little bit about seed dispersal. Okay, so mutually benefiting both the plant and the animal that is dispersing the seeds. And so another way that both of these species can benefit is through caching. And so here we have a squirrel or a Clark's nutcracker type of bird. These guys save seeds, right? In this case, they save acorns, dig a little hole or put it into a cavity within a tree so that they have food all winter long. Super cool. The thing though is that for the most part, squirrels in particular, they cache so much before the winter, and they don't do this in one place. They kind of dig holes like all over the place. Generally, before the winter is over, they forget where all of their little caches are. And so what they're essentially doing is planting a bunch of seeds. And so this is particularly common in the Southwest, in the one part that actually has lots of oaks. You see just like no oaks, no oaks, no oaks, and then all of a sudden this huge clump of oaks. And this isn't like one tree grew and dropped all its seeds right there. No, this is a squirrel that buried a bunch of acorns, forgot where it was, and all of those acorns started to grow. So again, you see that a lot. These animals are benefiting, of course, because they get to eat, but they're also helping the plant because they're dispersing the seeds farther away from the parent plant. Another kind of creative means of seed dispersal is myrmecochory. So this is where the plant actually adds like a tasty little treat on the top of the seed. So not like a fruit, but what's called an elaiosome. So super sugary, super sweet, yummy little structure on top of the seed. This is going to attract ants. And so the ant picks up the seed and it carries away and it brings it into its nest or, wherever the colony is living. It eats the tasty treat, the elaiosome, this here, and doesn't use the seed. It just leaves the seed where it is. And so again, the ant is it is planting the seed by bringing it down into the ground, into its colony, and the seed can grow from there. Right? So it's not like on the surface of the ground where somebody else might pick it up and eat it. It is protected within the ant's gallery. Okay. Of course, a lot of plants produce fruits, and so the seeds are inside and they are surrounded by this fleshy, tasty, sweet fruit. And so obviously that is very appealing to an animal for seed dispersal, not just things like squirrels, but humans as well, right? Like we distribute seeds all over the world because the fruits are so darn tasty. Generally, the plant assures that the seeds are dispersed only when the seeds are ready by ripening the fruit. So if you've ever like picked an apple before it was ripe, it's like really bitter and like has this weird texture. Or like ever eaten an unripe fruit. The best fruit, of course, is ripened, and the fruit ripens only when the seed is ready to be planted. Okay, and so these examples here, right, the caching the seeds, the dispersing the fruit with the seeds inside. These are called non-symbiotic mutualisms because they are not living together. So a symbiosis, the organisms have to be living together, but as we can see, organisms can benefit from one another, even if they're not part of the same structure. A couple other terms that are important for describing organisms or describing these mutualisms or other interactions are facultative versus obligate. Facultative is when the species can survive without each other. So this is apple trees. Like apple trees definitely benefit from humans and other animals distributing their seeds, but apples can, of course, fall on the ground right next to the tree and can grow from there. They don't need this mutualistic relationship. Versus obligate. Obligate is when both species need to interact with one another in order for both to survive. Okay. Mutualisms don't just exist for pollination. They don't just exist for offspring dispersal. They also exist for nutrition. And so the first example I have for you here are corals. We talked about these earlier this semester. Of course, the coral itself is an animal, but it is an obligate symbiont with algae. So two different species, at least, if not more, must interact with one another in order for both to survive. And so essentially the coral itself, it has specialized cells that host this symbiotic algae. So this algae that lives within the coral. And so the algae gets this nice cushy place to live. It is protected from everything else. It gets various substrates. So it's kind of fed. And in return, the coral gets a lot of its carbon and a lot of its energy from these photosynthetic algae. Okay, so as we talked about earlier, if the temperature of the water gets too high, if the acidity gets too much, so the pH gets too low, that kills off the algae, and therefore the coral is going to die as well. And so again, both of these need to be existing together in order for the coral to survive, both to survive. On land, we have similar interactions, similar obligate mutualistic interactions. And this example is lichen. And so here we see two different species of lichen, actually probably three different species of lichen. These are a symbiotic interaction between algae or cyanobacteria, so some kind of photosynthesizer supplying nutrients or supplying sugar to a fungus. And just like the coral, the fungus is going to provide a nice cushy place to live, lots of protection and moisture inside the plant, even though on the outside they're very dry. So the fungus providing nutrients and water, the photosynthesizer providing sugar, essentially. And so these can grow in extremely inhospitable climates, but in order for them to grow, they need both species, the fungus and the photosynthesizer. Another example, termites. Both mammals and termites actually, and many other species, of course, do not have the gene to break down cellulose, to break down fiber in plants. And so we, as well as termites, still eat plant matter all the time, especially termites. Their whole job is to eat wood. And so when the termites, for example, eat the wood, they aren't using their own enzymes, their own cellulase enzymes to break down their food and therefore have something to eat or actually get nutrients from the food, the wood. Instead, they provide a nice cushy environment for microbes, so for their gut flora, and it is the microbes who are responsible for producing that cellulase enzyme to break down the wood and therefore release the sugars into an actually digestible form for the termite. And so if your sole food source is wood and you can't actually digest wood without your friend, your friend's the gut flora, you absolutely need, right, obligate symbiotic mutualistic relationship with the gut flora. Okay, and of course, we also have gut flora. We know how important they are to us as well, and arguably our mutualistic relationship with our gut flora is also obligate. And we know this because when people are on antibiotics for a long time and their gut flora is destroyed, oftentimes they can contract illnesses such as C. diff, and this is, fatal conditions. Right? So our gut flora also very important. We eat fiber, in fact, partially to feed our gut flora so that our gut flora can do all sorts of other lovely things throughout our body. Okay. Another example, legumes. So a group of plants that specifically attract nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And so these plants, such as peas, such as a lot of beans, some trees, in fact, these guys secrete chemicals from their roots, right? These here secreting chemicals from the roots to attract the rhizobium bacteria. And so the bacteria will actually infect the plant's roots, and this is a good thing, it's not a bad thing, and they will stimulate the root to grow a little tumor, which is called a nodule. And so if we look at this image here, we see lots of little nodules. These are essentially little bacterial hotels. Okay, and so this seems like it would be bad for the plant, but in fact, this is, of course, mutually beneficial to both. The bacteria, they are going to fix gaseous nitrogen. And so our atmosphere is like 80% nitrogen, but plants can't actually use it. We can't actually use it directly. Instead, this has to be fixed. It has to be converted into a more usable form. And so the plant is actually very much benefiting from this fixing process of the bacteria. And of course, in return, bacteria gets a nice cushy hotel that it stimulated for itself. It is built exactly the way the bacteria likes. Okay, so if you remove the bacteria, the plant often dies, or at least it is very much inhibited in its growth. If you remove the plant, of course, the bacteria doesn't have a lot of protection, and so it also dies as well. Okay, mutualistic interaction. Okay. Final example here, super important. So this symbiotic mutualistic relationship between plant roots and a fungus. So not only do certain species of plant interact with bacteria in a beautiful way, but also a fungus as well. And so this is a lot more common, in fact, not just limited to the legumes, but many, many plants utilize mycorrhizae fungus. And so what you can see here is that the fungus also interacts with the roots. It grows into them in a couple different ways, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And so essentially the fungus is pulling in water, it is pulling in minerals, it is pulling in different things from the soil into the roots, and therefore significantly increasing the surface area to pull things into the plant. In exchange for this kind of these recruitment efforts by the mycorrhizae, the plant feeds the fungus with sugar. Okay, so the fungus is fed and the plant also gets what it needs as well. Okay, and so two different growth types, endomycorrhizae and ectomycorrhizae. The ectomycorrhizae, ecto meaning like on the outside, and so these mycelia penetrate in between the cells and they cover the outside of the root. Most species, most plants utilize endomycorrhizae instead. And so this is when the fungus actually literally grows into the cells of the plant to to provide a more efficient connection between both types of cells. Okay, so super important. Sometimes you can even see this mycorrhizae with the naked eye. Okay. Final topic in this lesson is how do we model these mutualistic relationships? Here we have two graphs showing species 1 and species 2, just hypothetical species. What we can see here is two different lines. The solid line, is what happens to species 1 when you take away species 2, or if species 2 is not around. And so we can see that, maybe this species 1 can actually survive without it, but really not as much as if species 2 was around. Okay, so here we can see species 1 very much benefits, so more than twice the abundance, more than twice the population size, if species 2 is present. Okay, and so this is not an obligate relationship, right? If it was an obligate relationship, what we would see is that the solid line would stay at 0 because species 1 could not survive without species 2. Okay, and we know that this is mutualistic because the same pattern is seen in the other species as well, right? So still, its survival, its abundance is much less if species 1 is not present. Okay, so because both species kind of need each other, or at least benefit from each other, this would be a mutualistic relationship. Okay, and so very briefly, I want to point out some of the math that can be done to model these mutualistic relationships, and of course can be used to determine whether this is mutualistic or something else. Okay, so here we have species 1, the plant, for example, and species 2, the mycorrhizae from the last slide. And so we can model the, essentially, like we talked about in the last portion of this class, the dn/dt, or the dn of species 1, the plant. Essentially, how many new individuals are going to be present in the next generation, right? So the population growth rate. And so some of this should look kind of familiar to you, right? So the per capita growth rate times this current population of plants. So species 1, the plant, but what's going on here in the parentheses gets a little bit different. And what I want to point out is this alpha variable right here. So we see it's alpha sub 2,1. So this is essentially the effect of species 2 on species 1. Okay, and so we can see that that actually changes the carrying capacity and is going to change the population growth rate. Okay, so again, alpha, the per capita effect, the effect of species 2, the first one is of species 2 on species 1. Okay, so we're not going to do that math, but this is how you would. Okay, for species 2, we also use alpha, right? So the per capita effect of species 1, right? So of 1 on 2. Okay, so what is the effect of the plant on the mycorrhizae? And so again, similar to math to what we've been doing, but now we get to see how this effect of one species on the other is going to influence the carrying capacity and the population growth. Okay, if we did the math, and of course we can get the idea from these graphs over here, we can see that the presence of the mutualist, right, of the mycorrhizae or the plant, actually increases the carrying capacity of the other species. And so with the presence of the mycorrhizae or the plant, it is actually going to allow each species to reach a higher density in the presence of the other species. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Look forward to talking to you soon about additional interspecific interactions. Thanks.